Thank you for joining us for our fiscal year 16 announcement of Indian Country's gross gaming revenue, or GGR. This event is being broadcast through Adobe Connect and through conference audio. It will be recorded for video playback and transcribed. The video and press materials will be available on our online media center at nigc.gov/media after this event. Indian Country's 2016 gross gaming revenue numbers will be presented to you by the Chairman of the National Indian Gaming Commission, Jonadev Osceola Chowdhury, Vice Chair Catherine Isom-Clause, and Commissioner Sequoia Simmermeyer. The commissioners, as well as NIGC's Director of Finance, Yvonne Lee, will be available for questions after the announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. I give you the Chairman of the National Indian Gaming Commission.
Thank you, Ms. Myers. Good afternoon, XG. I would like to start off by saying thank you to the tribal leaders, regulators, members of the regulated community, and organizational representatives, including the chairman of the National Indian Gaming Association, Mr. Ernie Stevens, who are joining us here today, both in person and virtually. My name is Jonadev Osceola Chowdhury, and I am a proud citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. I'm honored to serve as chairman of the National Indian Gaming Commission. Joining me today are my fellow commissioners, Vice Chair Isom-Clause and Commissioner Sequoia Simmermeyer, who will provide additional remarks in a moment. We're here today to report on the 2016 gross gaming revenue numbers for Indian Country. However, we would be remiss if we didn't put those numbers into historical context. Gross gaming revenue success is due, at least in part, to the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act's promotion of tribal self-determination principles. Modern federal Indian law and policy is built on the government-to-government relationship between the United States and tribal nations. Self-determination is a fundamental pillar of federal Indian law policy that informs wide-ranging legislation, including the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, or IGRA. When Congress passed IGRA almost 30 years ago, Congress expressly cited in its findings and purposes the long-standing federal policy goal to promote tribal economic development, tribal self-sufficiency, and strong tribal governments. This goal is a self-determination principle. IGRA crafted this framework on the heels of the watershed Supreme Court case, California versus Cabazon, which recognized the inherent authority of tribes to regulate gaming on their lands. Accordingly, IGRA specifically noted that numerous tribes had already been conducting lawful gaming on Indian lands as a means of generating governmental revenue. In keeping with the Cabazon decision, IGRA recognized tribes' inherent sovereignty to regulate their own gaming, and although it did give states a role in the industry, it preserved the role of tribes as the primary regulators of their gaming. It further created the specific federal obligation to help protect tribal assets and operations. So, IGRA's statutory framework emerged from an environment in which legal tribal gaming already existed, the inherent sovereign authority of tribes to regulate that gaming had already been affirmed, and the policy of tribal self-determination had been firmly established. This reinforcement of self-determination policy that formed the basis of IGRA guides our day-to-day work here at NIGC and informs our ongoing efforts to work with our regulatory partners to protect the Indian gaming industry as a means of generating tribal revenue. The continued prosperity of the industry is revealed year after year in our annual announcement of gross gaming revenue. The GGR provides a window into the economic health of Indian gaming, and the commissioners and I are pleased to share that with you today. So, here it is. Revenues have once again exceeded those of the previous fiscal year. We're happy to announce that the fiscal year 2016 gross gaming revenue is $31.2 billion. The fiscal year GGR shows a 4.4% increase over the previous fiscal year. This is the highest GGR on record, and it reflects how well the long-standing principles of tribal self-determination work in Indian Country. This, of course, is excellent news for so many tribal nations and local communities who rely on Indian gaming. However, it must always be remembered that not all tribes game. The majority of tribes that do have modest operations, and gaming revenue was never intended to supplant other programs and policies that further self-determination. With that, I would like to ask Vice Chair Isom-Clause to speak to you further about what gross gaming revenue means and the importance of gaming revenues to tribes.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. I'm Catherine Isom-Clause. I'm Vice Chair of the Commission, and I'm Taos Pueblo. The 2016 gross gaming revenue is calculated based on 484 independently audited financial statements from 491 gaming facilities. These facilities are owned by 244 tribes in 29 gaming states. The GGR is the amount wagered minus winnings returned to players. GGR is the figure used to determine what a gaming operation earns before salaries for employees and other operating expenses are paid. It is important to remember that GGR is not an indicator of profit available to tribes, but an overall indicator of the well-being of the industry. It also reflects the positive impacts that extend beyond tribal communities and into surrounding local and state economies. Indian gaming creates a foundation for employment and business development, including vendors, entertainment, retail, and beyond, providing economic opportunities in some of the most underserved areas in the United States. The majority of gross gaming revenue comes from smaller gaming tribes, often located in rural areas. In fact, 57% of all tribal gaming facilities make less than $25 million in revenue annually. For small and rural tribes who may have limited economic opportunities to support self-sufficiency, gaming operations have been a lifeline. Revenue from Indian gaming supports tribal program budgets, allowing tribes to provide important governmental services for their citizens, such as family services, education, cultural and language revitalization, infrastructure, and more. I would now like to introduce Commissioner Simmermeyer, who will provide region-specific information.
Thank you, Commissioner. Hello and good afternoon. I'm Sequoia Simmermeyer, Associate Commissioner of the National Indian Gaming Commission and a member of the Coharie Tribe from North Carolina. For administrative reasons, the National Indian Gaming Commission is divided among 7 geographic regions. The regions help the agency to provide on-the-ground regulatory oversight to all of Indian country gaming. Each of the 7 administrative regions reported growth. The Sacramento region, which includes all tribal gaming operations in California and northern Nevada, showed the highest percentage increase at 6.3% growth with a GGR of $8.4 billion. Operations in the Oklahoma City and Portland regions showed a 5.7 and 5.1% growth in their GGRs respectively. The remaining regions all showed growth ranging from 1.1% to 4.4%. Tribal empowerment through federal self-determination policies, as well as tribes' steadfast efforts and creative entrepreneurial spirits, continue to be driving forces in the success of the Indian gaming industry. Many factors can contribute to a tribal gaming operation's increased gross gaming revenues. Improved local economies and growth in other businesses and tourism, as well as sound decision-making by tribes with regard to new gaming facilities, expansions, or renovations, can all cause a GGR increase. Indian gaming's continued success provides not only revenue for tribal government services, its success also provides resources to statewide and local economies. The National Indian Gaming Commission supports Indian gaming by providing training, technical assistance, and enforcement. The agency's work helps tribes to remain the sole beneficiaries of their gaming revenue, protect the integrity of tribes' gaming facilities, and ensure safe and fair play for consumers, all of which support a strong market and industry. The National Indian Gaming Commission's regulatory activities, along with 30 years of regulatory experience and governmental partnerships, help to provide stable expectations for a healthy and vibrant industry. Thank you. I'll turn this back over to the Chairman for his closing comments.
Thank you, fellow commissioners. All of Indian country has worked very hard to reach the significant milestone of $31.2 billion and should be very, very proud. Our partnerships with tribes and tribal regulators has strengthened Indian gaming. As a result, it has become the most important economic driver of modern day. There is no other driver that has been able to do what Indian gaming has done for Indian country. The Commission and I are honored to be a part of such a significant milestone. The successes of Indian gaming since Cabazon prove that the foundational principles of federal Indian law and policy should continue as goals for IGRA and all other laws that help to implement IGRA. Thank you to everyone for attending today's press conference, and we welcome your questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now open the floor to questions from our in-person audience and our virtual audience. In order to ensure that as many of you as possible have the opportunity to ask questions, please limit yourself to one question and one follow-up. If time remains, we will come back around for additional questions. Please raise your hand and I will acknowledge you and provide your name and affiliation for the record and to whom your question is directed. For those wishing to participate virtually through Adobe Connect, please provide your name and affiliation when you type your question in the chat box. We'll alternate questions between in-the-room attendees, our virtual conference room, and those that have called in on our conference line. We'll now take the first question. Mr. Batt?
John Duff, I know that you don't lobby on Capitol Hill, but I'm curious with these very encouraging numbers for Indian country, how much would it mean to tribal casinos throughout the country if Congress passes the Tribal Labor Sovereignty Act, which would essentially exempt the tribal casinos from the National Labor Relations Act?
Well, I appreciate that question, Tony. I mean, we're here today to talk about the GGR numbers, and you're right that we stay in our lane and don't step into congressional matters unless asked. But I would point to a couple of the key themes that we touched on in our opening statements. One, the role of larger self-determination and sovereignty principles that help form IGRA in the first place, and the success of those principles on the ground in terms of the economic landscape that has been created by the regulatory structure of IGRA. So I think there are important takeaways from bolstering tribal self-determination, bolstering sovereignty in a way that ensures a fair playing field. That's about all I'll say about that, but we made that point for a reason. The principles of self-determination have been a success, and those need to be considered in terms of considering what the next 30 years should look like on the policy and legal landscape. And so I don't know if that helps.
Yes, but if I could follow up, with these encouraging numbers, what do you see, say, over the next 30 years? What do you see as the biggest obstacle or biggest challenge confronting the NIGC and tribal gaming in general?
Well, again, here to talk about GGR, but the ongoing challenge has always been supporting tribes' ability to perform their work in a manner consistent with true self-determination principles. And part of that involves the underlying goals of supporting strong tribal economic development, tribal self-sufficiency, and strong tribal governments. For that, you need to be as flexible as possible when one considers the historic development of Indian policy and the very different histories all tribal nations have in terms of how they develop their land bases. I would strongly recommend that flexibility be incorporated into any proposed ideas about how to improve the process, flexibility in terms of taking into account the unique historical nature of all Indian lands, so that any efforts to support tribal economic development or self-sufficiency truly reflects the very differently situated tribes that are among the 567 tribal nations that are recognized. So flexibility consistent with self-determination, consistent with the ability to have tribes determine the best use of their community's resources should be the hallmark. So I know I'm not giving many specifics, but I, for one, don't advocate for a one-size-fits-all when it comes to addressing issues of how to enhance self-determination. So. Oh no. Additional questions, Tony? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Operator, by chance, are there any calls on the line at this time?
At this time on the phone line, if participants would like to ask a question, please do so by pressing star followed by 1. You will just be prompted to record your name, ensure your phone is unmuted, and please record your first and last name. One moment to see if there's any phone questions. There are no questions on the phone line.
Thank you. By chance, are there any questions coming from the Adobe Connect conference room? Okay, then I'll come back. Any questions from the audience? Yes, Mr. Commissioner.
Yes, Ernest Stevens with the National Indian Gaming Association. I just wanted to, I appreciate the emphasis that there was still so much work to do in your presentation, Chairman Chowdhury, today. But I would like to just quickly ask, we go back to the National Indian Gaming Association goes back to the era where we wanted to prepare ourselves for some of the challenges. So the success of not just the $31 billion industry, but the regulation and the things that we're doing out there nowadays, these are things that were planned, and these are things that were worked through by the leadership, not just with the National Indian Gaming Association, but National Congress of American Indians, our National Regulators Association. So we're very proud of this number. We're very excited to be here with you today. But if you could just give us just a little bit of a summary of some of your working relationship with the primary regulators of Indian country that oversee have the tribal oversight. And again, I appreciate your acknowledgement, Mr. Chairman, regarding the work that still needs to be done yet.
Thank you, Chairman. Excellent question. Let me touch on some of the themes that we already discussed to provide the lead into the discussion. So, mentioned how IGRA flowed out of self-determination principles, and IGRA was reflective of self-determination policies, but was never intended to supplant policies or programs that also support self-determination. That's an important point, because what IGRA did, it recognized the longstanding principle goal of supporting strong tribal governments, self-sufficiency, and strong tribal economic development, and created a regulatory framework to support that larger policy goal. Within that regulatory framework, IGRA preserved the tribe's position as the primary regulators of Indian gaming. It also carved out a role for all of us as federal regulators to do whatever we can to protect tribal assets and resources. So because of the framework that was created by IGRA, that itself was intended to further advance a very important self-determination policy, we recognize not only the policy value, but the practical value of working with our regulatory partners. So each one of our agency representatives works very hard to maintain positive working relationships with tribal regulators. There are approximately 6,000 tribal regulators in the field, as well as other folks who play an important role in the regulation of gaming, always with tribes as the primary regulators. So that includes, in some cases, where because of the nature of certain compacts, there are state officials involved, state regulators, local law enforcement. We work very hard to maintain strong collaborative relationships. And that's not just a matter of feel-good policy, that's a matter of pragmatism. Because if our goal is to achieve compliance to support the larger federal policy of strong tribal governments, self-sufficiency, and economic development, we need to address compliance issues before they become significant. And the best way to do that is work with the regulators on the ground who have the strongest interest of anybody as tribal regulators in protecting tribal assets and operations. So we enhance those relationships through training, through technical assistance, and even through enforcement actions. We never shirk from our enforcement responsibilities, but when we do bring an enforcement action, the groundwork has already been laid so that our regulatory partners in Indian country know that we bring those enforcement actions with the goal of strengthening the industry as a whole. So those are some of the things that we do from the top down as an agency to strengthen the regulatory framework in Indian country and do it in a way that is supportive of our underlying federal policy mission, as well as respectful of the specific capacities and authorities of our tribal regulatory partners. And that's very important to us, and thank you for that question, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
At this time, operator, I'll turn back to you to see if we have any questions on the line.
There are no questions currently. Just as a reminder, please press star followed by 1 if you would like to ask a question.
Any questions from the Adobe conference room? We do have one. Okay, stand by.
The question from the Adobe conference room is from Ace from ABS.com. Is the NIGC changing its priorities or doing anything different since there's a new president in the office?
Could you please repeat the question?
The last part.
Is the NIGC changing its priorities or doing anything different since there's a new president in office?
Thank you for that question. As mentioned before, our agency was created by Congress as a regulatory agency. And so we're an independent agency housed within the Department of the Interior. But when we were created, a lot of thought was put into our structure. Our structure, I believe by design, is nonpartisan. Our structure enhances our ability to support compliance, support regulation in a way that is independent of political factors. That's why there's diversity of perspectives, diversity of party affiliation already built into our agency structure. So our terms are statutory terms that don't track the larger administration's terms, and that allows us to focus first and foremost on the regulation of Indian gaming and supporting an industry that is so important not just to Indian country but to the general public in a way that truly incorporates fundamental federal policies as well as protects public safety and welfare. We do that in a way independent of other things in the air. So right now we're in the process of formalizing some of the objectives and initiatives that have guided our agency for frankly several years, and those objectives include our initiatives, which is protecting against anything that amounts to gamesmanship on the backs of tribes. It's a regulatory phrase for ensuring IGRA's requirement that tribes retain their primary beneficiary status. We're also fully committed to staying ahead of the technology curve. We're fully committed to strengthening and advancing a strong workforce, both among our regulatory partners and within the agency, and we're committed to strong rural outreach. In addition to that, we're working on a strategic plan that highlights operational excellence as another pillar objective of the agency. So there have been no changes in terms of our commitment to achieving compliance in a way that is truly efficient in the manner it uses all of our agency authorities, but also at the same time respectful of the capabilities of our partners, sovereign tribal nations. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to turn it back to our live audience to see if there are additional questions. Great. Operator, do you have any questions on the line?
We do. Our first question is from Aaron Stanley. You may go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. Aaron Stanley with CDC Gaming Reports here. I was just hoping you could give a bit more color on kind of you mentioned all 7 districts or all 7 jurisdictions reported increases in revenue during the fiscal year. And I was just hoping you could kind of give a bit more color. I'm sure some of this will be in, in the reports that you guys post later on, but if you could offer a bit more color into, perhaps what was kind of driving some of the growth in California and some of the other regions that were really produced strong years.
Yes, thank you for that question. I'll turn that over to Ms. Yvonne Lee, our Director of Finance.
All regions across the board show GGR growth in 2016, which is an indicator of the overall health of the industry. We divided the nation into 7 geographic regions. It's purely for administrative reasons. The GGR growth of individual regions should not be interpreted as the indicator of local economy for that specific region. There are several factors that could impact the GGR growth in any specific region. Economic factor could be one of them, but there are also factors such as new casinos, casino expansions, or casino constructions, or even change in physical year-end date. All those could impact the GGR number.
Well, that's helpful, but is there any additional, color that might be useful in kind of writing a story on that? That's just not all that exciting, I guess. Is there anything else you guys can offer?
I think they want you to spin it for them, Yvonne. Let me just, this is John Deb again. So obviously the kind of inferences that may be drawn from the specific breakdown are up to the writers and the readers of the larger media world. But what I can say is the fact that there was a broad increase in GGR says at least 2 things. One, that there continues to be stable, steady growth in the Indian gaming industry that transcends geographic boundaries. That's first and foremost. And second, the connection between strong regulatory structure of Indian gaming and a fair and predictable industry has yielded benefits on a national scale, so much so that the geographic benefits are pretty evenly shared. So I think those are 2 fair takeaways, but any further speculation we'd probably decline to engage in. But I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Director Lee, but okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, yes, those charts will be available on the Media Center on the NIGC website. Any additional specific questions that you have, please just contact Director of Public Affairs. At this time, I need to move on to the next question.
There are no questions further on the audio side. Again, please press star followed by 1 if you do have a question.
Great, thank you. No questions coming from the Adobe conference room. Any in the room? Great, Chairman.
Again, I would just like to thank everybody who is in the room today and joining us virtually. I'd especially like to thank fellow commissioners for their work day in and day out to lead the agency, and I'd like to thank the agency team for putting together today's press conference. I do want to say there's a lot in the air, and I'm sure folks would like us to speak on a number of discussions that are going on. We always stay in our lane at NIGC. We're regulators first and foremost, and I think that's where our credibility within the larger landscape comes from, our ability to regulate and ensure compliance in a fair and even manner. But I do want to say that in terms of things that impact the success of Indian gaming, which is really created by the primary regulators of Indian gaming, things that may impact Indian gaming are relevant to us. We're governed by a statute that, as I said before, grows out of self-determination principles, but a lot of larger discussions affect Indian gaming. So all I would like to say is the idea that self-empowerment isn't just a removal of federal restrictions in Indian country is an important one. Self-determination brings with it a recognition of the special relationship between the federal government and tribal nations. That special relationship is reflected in the obligations that NIGC has to support tribal activities and resources. And so there are no easy answers when considering how to shape the next 30 years of Indian policy. But I would urge anybody who's considering doing so to keep in mind that self-determination involves flexibility for tribal nations to do the best that they can given their unique histories and resources, but also flexibility so that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to the contours of tribal nations. And there's a recognition of the unique histories of all tribal nations so that if the idea is to support strong tribal economic development, self-sufficiency, and strong tribal governments, the unique histories of land loss, movement, unique geographic and market considerations is considered, and one size fits all solutions are what's the word? We get away from one size fits all solutions. So I'd just like to leave with that note. And again, thank you all for being here today, and thank you.
Yes, thank you all for participating in our fiscal year 16 gross gaming revenue press conference. As a final reminder, the gross gaming revenue materials are available online in our media center at nigc.gov/media, or you can contact the Division of Public Affairs at 202-632-7033 if you have any additional questions or follow-up for the commission. Thank you again for your time today. Have a wonderful afternoon.